Happy Thanksgiving, Minnows. So, I was able to watch the newest Disney film, Strange World, a day early, which is why this video is coming out on its release date. And, it's an interesting movie for sure. This has got to be one of, if not the weirdest things to come out of Walt Disney Animation Studios. And not just in terms of the premise. I mean, I expected that from the trailers. I also mean in terms of how it tells its story and conveys its messages. In terms of where this falls in comparison to the other Disney films, I'd say it's significantly weaker than Encanto, but a slight improvement over Raya and the Last Dragon. Similar to the latter, it's a lot more action-oriented with its story and tone. The director of this film, Don Hall, is the man behind both of these movies, in addition to a couple of the other films from the revival era like Big Hero 6. I think the direction and overall visual style he adds to his movies, specifically his action sequences, are very strong, and the same thing applies to this movie. The downside is that I feel like that's the only exceptional element here when looking at this film as a sci-fi. There's hardly anything that really makes it stand out from any other fantasy world that Disney's created. Visually, it's stunning, but there's no real explanation for how any aspects of this world work and operate until the very ending. It makes it come across as random and structureless at times. It's not like every aspect of a film's world has to make sense to me for me to enjoy myself. Take a look at a movie like Alice in Wonderland, which is another adventure in a wacky, nonsensical world where barely anything makes sense. But it works in that movie since it functions as an exploration of the mind of a 7-year-old child. It makes sense for that world to be messy, not this one, especially considering how heavily it ties into the main storyline. The reason that the main character Searcher has to go on this expedition is because their hometown source of power, these plants that he found on an expedition with his dad, are starting to die off, so they have to go down to the strange world to figure out why. But Searcher doesn't want to do it because he's just a farmer who wants to look after his family. I do like the way it establishes his life after his father disappeared, but the quest itself lacks any form of urgency or stakes because we're hardly shown the gravity of it. The way these seemingly important plants dying affects his home. I guess I can sort of understand them doing this for the twist at the end of the film, but it makes this plot development being the inciting incident not make much sense. So story-wise, this movie is kind of all over the place. And keep in mind, I'm leaving out a lot of key information to avoid spoilers. So do the characters make up for that? To a degree. I have two that I have problems with. So Searcher's internal conflict throughout this movie is wanting to distance himself from his father and having insecurities about his son Ethan taking after him and not being a farmer. I like how this gets challenged by having all three generations interact with each other, and we get to see the different perspectives on what he, Ethan, and Jaeger all want out of life, and where they are with achieving those desires. Searcher's content with his role as a farmer, Jaeger has doubts about what it cost him to be an explorer, and Ethan's still trying to discover himself and what he wants independent from both of them. This leads to a lot of really good interactions, particularly between Searcher and Ethan. Also, unlike every other Disney product in the past 5 years, Ethan doesn't merely exist as the token gay character. They actually incorporate that aspect of his character into his arc in a natural way, and he's definitely the funniest character in the movie. Jabuki Young White sells all of it, and his voice played a large role in my enjoyment of him. Oh yeah, speaking of which, this movie's comedy is perfectly fine. I was really worried going in that there'd be a ton of modern talk in it, like with Raya, but aside from the jokes present in the trailers, it's mostly kept to a minimum. As for the other characters, Meridian's pretty enjoyable too. Admittedly, she isn't given as much to do as the others, but she was still enjoyable. Honestly, I forgot Lucy Liu was even in this one halfway through. She's not awful, but she doesn't do anything remotely interesting, and her previous connections with the Clades adds nothing to the story. I can't even really call her a plot device due to how minimal her role is. Also, Ethan meets this little blue blob creature during the movie, and it feels like it's meant to fill the role of an animal sidekick, even though they already have the actual animal for that. I don't know, something about this thing's existence reeks of cheapness noticeably more than usual. The design is lazy, most of the slapstick and interactions with the characters really aren't that funny. At one point, one of the background characters says to Blue Blob, "It's so cute, I want to merchandise it." What? Look, I'm not gonna act like Disney inventing new sidekicks to sell toys is anything new, but at least most of them are funny and cute in their respective movies. But this thing isn't either. That's more so personal taste though, maybe you'll enjoy Blobby more than I did. And finally, we have Jaeger Clade. He's probably the biggest disappointment in this movie from a character standpoint. Everything outside of his role as an explorer is very underdeveloped. He discusses late in the film the impact of what happened after he went missing. I wanted to get emotionally invested, but I don't think this movie gives us nearly enough information about his life before or during this period of success. It just frames it as he's an explorer and Searcher isn't. It tries to give him more backstory beyond this, but it doesn't spend nearly enough time on it. And that's what I mean when I say this film's mythos is so weird in addition to the story. It places its emphasis on the plot when its strengths clearly lie with the characters, and it makes both the environmental commentary and the message about individualism both come across as shallow. I really did want to like this one more. It does feel distinct from a lot of Disney's other works, but it's got some of the messiest storytelling of any of the films I've seen from them in recent memory. In terms of whether or not you should watch this in theaters, maybe just wait for this one to come out on Disney+, unless you're like me and really into sci-fi. But at the end of the day, the strengths present with the characters and most of the humor barely keep this one afloat for me. So, 6 out of 10. Maybe my thoughts might change for the better on rewatch though, and there's a lot more spoilery things that I do want to talk about in this film eventually. I will let you guys know my updated thoughts in the 2022 animation ranking video.